welcome you all to this first session. And this also happens to be the first session that I am moderating ever in my life. So, I'm very so the session today is the great tribal heroes of Bharat. And we have Mr. Tuhin Sinha, who is the national spokesperson of the BJP. So a full-time politician who, interestingly, your bio, sir, if I could just read it, says you have a maverick knack to experiment with new genres. So any reason why you chose to write about the unsung heroes of India?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Yamini. You know, I believe when you've traveled the world, your journey inwards begin. So when I first published my first book was published in 2006. That was the time when Indian publishing industry, with Indian titles as the dominant, Indian publishing industry was opening up to Indian titles in a big way. So from there on, since we've grown up in a generation where we never in our school days would want to become authors, or being an author was a completely alien profession. But it somehow never struck us that we could be full-time authors. So after my first book, I took it as a challenge to experiment with the next 5 books. So the second was a cricket thriller called 22 Yards. The next 3 were socio-political thrillers: Of Love and Politics, The Edge of Desire, The Edge of Power. And then, there was a parenting book from a dad's point of view, which is probably India's first parenting book from a dad's point of view, called Daddy. Now, after around 9 books, there was this challenge, what next? And simultaneously, from 2016, 17 onwards, I've had a parallel career. I've been entrenched in politics. And so the challenge was to kind of weave the socio-political narrative prevalent in the country at this point of time into my writing. And since I have grown up in a place called Jamshedpur, which has lots of tribal hamlets all around, during my growing up days, there used to be a lot of curiosity around Birsa Munda. Because if any of you have traveled to Jharkhand, yeah, can we just have a little silence, please? So if any of you have traveled across Jharkhand, you would invariably come across statues of Birsa Munda. But in those days, obviously, because we approached our history with a very colonial mindset, there was very little authenticated, corroborated material around Birsa Munda. So that curiosity to know more about Birsa Munda's revolution had remained unquenched. And of course, from a marketing perspective, today it makes sense to think of a series around it. So Birsa Munda was the first book that was followed by The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, which is a collection of 17 different essays on unknown tribal freedom fighters. And the third part of the trilogy is around Siddho Kano, which is a revolution that happened in 1855. It was a revolution led by Santhals. I don't know how many of you over here are aware of it, but in terms of the geographical spread of that revolution, that spread from the present-day Bhagalpur in Bihar to the northern districts of Jharkhand, which is Dumka, Sahebganj, and right up to the periphery of Kolkata. And it was a community-led movement that went on for a good 8-9 months. So, like one set of people or one set of villages would rise in revolt. That revolt would be quelled. And then a few weeks down the line, because there were obviously no established modes of communication. So communication would happen via writing on, scribbling something on leaves, and those would be carried in a relay method across to villages, maybe 100 kilometers far. So simultaneously, after the revolt would be quelled in one place, it would awaken people in another part of the region would be awakened, and the revolt went on for a good 8 to 9 months and completely shook the British Empire in that region. So that explains my shift, or that explains my foray into this genre.
the tribal leaders were among the first groups to fight the colonizing British, but a large number of them are relatively unknown. In fact, very few of us know about
So in
them.
fact, that is one of the key objectives of this book.
No, so my question is, why do you think it was largely unreported for such a long
Two
time?
reasons. One, history has always been written from the point of view of emperors and rulers. That's number one. Number two, I think we, post-independence, we had a chance to correct our narration of history. But somewhere the colonial mindset, the dominance of Marxist slash, Congress favored historians went on for too long. So they were more interested in igniting a Tipu Sultan than the tribal freedom fighters. But why, knowing about these unknown tribal freedom fighters is important is because our freedom movement, let me say this with a lot of responsibility, our freedom movement was not the fiefdom of any one political party. It did not start in 1885 with the formation of the Congress Party, because when you subscribe to that mindset, you start dividing freedom fighters. You start questioning the contribution of Savarkar. You start making it my set of freedom fighters versus your set of freedom fighters. Our freedom movement in the right earnest has been going on from 1783, which is, the first chapter of the book on the great tribal warriors of Bharat. That was a revolution led in the present Bhagalpur region. And, tribal mutinies and tribal revolutions have been far more complex than the conventional freedom movement or the conventional political freedom movement. Because Britishers would seldom travel to the hinterlands, to some of the remotest areas. So they would outsource their atrocities to two sources. One would be the local zamindars. The local zamindars would execute the financial oppression. And from 1850s onwards, there was a concerted attempt at cultural subjugation, which happened via, proselytization, predatory proselytization. So an attempt was made to import certain German missionaries, first in the area of present-day Jharkhand and then across the country. So that made the tribal freedom fight or the freedom struggle far more complex and complicated, because in many cases the tribal revolutionaries were not even aware of the exact enemy. They would be fighting the immediate enemies, which would be zamindars, and then they would suddenly realize that the ultimate enemy is way far off in Kolkata, sitting in Kolkata, and it was groping in the dark. Most of the times they would be groping in the dark. I think it's a classic. There's a lot to learn from these tribal mutinies. In fact, one of the books we want to approach in the future is leadership lessons or management lessons from these great tribal freedom fighters. Because if you ask me, I've spoken a lot before Suresh takes over. I'll just conclude by saying Birsa Munda had organized a private army around 1898-99 in the region of present-day Jharkhand. Subhash Chandra Bose did that on an international scale 4 decades later. Since the area of their operations was barely, separated by some 200 kilometers, could it have been possible that even Subhash Chandra Bose may have drawn inspiration from Birsa Munda? These are questions. I mean, as authors, as writers, I think it's important to, get into the zone and try to understand these tribal movements a little better.
So my next question is to you, Suraj. So Mr. Sinha had, he grown up in Jamshedpur, and where the legend of Birsa Munda, was. Okay. Okay. But you describe yourself as an army brat, and I read that you are a pharmacist with a management degree from IIM Kozhikode.
Yeah.
So how did a pharmacist get inspired to write about the Great Santhal War of 1855? You've written a book called Siddhu Kano with Mr. Sinha. So where did you get your inspiration from?
Okay, I'll try to summarize it. Good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon. Good morning, Heavy. Thank you, Yamini, for your question. And writing, I would say that a little bit of my background. Father is from Bihar state, so Jharkhand, Bihar, almost the same. So in a way, so little stories are there from there. Mom from Mangalore, so also understanding, and both in the army. So I had a different kind of stories coming from this thing. But I was born in Africa, Nigeria. I grew up there, and studied in local schools, so understand the tribal context out there also, because in the end it's about community and strength. Now, in terms of writing, I would say the movie Shawshank Redemption helped me there, because 2010 and all, I was having some conflict in the work after doing all the MBA work in corporate, what I'm doing in my life. So I'm not going to give the spoilers, but whoever's seen Shawshank Redemption understand what happens in the end. So I needed to find my own freedom, and I found through words I can do that. And that's where the first book, Baramulla Bomber, which is about science fiction movie, science fiction story in Kashmir. So I said, let me take Kashmir, let me take science fiction and cricket together. So quantum physics meets spy thrillers together. So I wrote that. So, and that's how I just kept on going ahead, and with Tuhin, we collaborated on another book before Sidhu Kanu, Mission Shenzhen, which we wrote around a story about how China wants to take over the world through a pandemic. So that was the thesis. It actually happened in a way. So, and Sidhu Kanu came in when Tuhin was writing the Great Tribals book, great book, 17 different stories. Everyone should read it, because these are things we have not read in our history books. And these are community voices, and we should understand that in different parts of India, there were independent thinkers trying for the same thing, freedom. Because ultimately there's freedom of action, but there's also freedom of the thought process and mind. And this is where the tribal people who are connected with nature, they have to have that freedom to operate and think about, and that's where the story comes in. So that's how we started with Sidhu Kanu. So, yeah.
So it's interesting you mention movies and celluloid. So there's not just a profusion of literature, but two of the warriors that you have mentioned here, Alluri Sitarama Raju and Komaram Bhim, they are protagonists of the blockbuster RRR. So what is changed today that authors and filmmakers want to tell stories of these unsung heroes?
Well, this is a different country, if you ask me, in the last 10 years. So a lot of things that we were shying away from, I think we are taking a lot of pride in those stories. And Alluri Sitaraju, I'm glad you mentioned him. Alluri Sitaraju, ideally one should not get into caste, but then, there are some people who are gung-ho on, making you acknowledge your caste, even in this era. Alluri Sitaram Raju was a Rajput. He was born into a Kshatriya family, but he dedicated his life to the cause of tribals of that area. So that makes so he's counted as one of the tribal revolutionaries, but I think his sacrifice was far greater. So I think, there is a sense of ownership today. We are owning up to our legacy, which somehow we had been apologetic about. And like I mentioned, what we have done through these 3 books is just the tip of the iceberg. There was a challenge, like I mentioned, because the authentic sources of information of these tribal freedom fighters are scarce. The reason is most of them came to limelight 20 years after they passed away. When there was a sudden land reform, which the Britishers initiated, that is when one tried to figure out where do you draw the start of it. And even the Britishers, after each revolt, would kind of do their homework, would realize that, if we don't make certain corrections, if we don't bring in certain, legislations in favor of Adivasis and in favor of tribals, it might lead to more revolts. So I think it's an ocean. This entire world is an ocean, and God willing, if we get the opportunity, I think with collaboration with one of the IAMs, we would want to approach the story of this entire thesis of how much we can learn. The present management gurus can learn from these tribal warriors.
There's an interesting line in the first chapter of Tilka Majhi, who incidentally was the first Adivasi leader from the Santhal community to take up arms against the British. And you say history tends to question if Tilka Majhi was a myth or a reality. How did you overcome this difficulty, or this would have been a challenge to find the actual story and the the circumstances leading to the revolt? So how did you overcome that challenge? I'm sure finding...
So with each of the 3 books, we followed a different approach. Okay. Because like I said, I was aware of the limitations when it comes to authenticated sources of information. So with Birsa Munda, and because Birsa Munda happened with my co-author Ankita Verma at that point of time, there were anyway restrictions on travel. It happened in the first 4 to 6 months of the pandemic. But with Birsa Munda, we consciously made it a novel. Because, I have if I'm not a historian, I will not necessarily present it as a book of history because I'm aware of my limitations. It's a novel. It was presented as a novel. With the second book, which is The Great Tribal Warriors of Bharat, we kind of accumulated all information available on public domain plus on relevant books with regard to these freedom fighters and tried to package it as a non-fictional chronicle of India's, freedom movement. So the span of this book, the first freedom fighter, the first revolution took place in 1783 and the last of the warriors, and I call him warrior even though like he was the only tribal representative in the Constituent Assembly, Jaipal Munda, but then he's a warrior because he's contributed essentially. So the span of this book, essentially from 1783 to 1947, tells you, chronicles the journey of a parallel freedom movement. So that is in non-fiction form. It is essentially an assembling of corroborated material available on public domain, plus on books, with the third book again, of which Clark will talk in greater detail. That's again in the form of a novel, because like I said, I mean, it's very difficult in hindsight to imagine Siddho Kano's character in its exactness, because most of these, I read in one of the books written by a foreign author, that many of the British sepoys who were utilized in crushing the 1855 revolt, eventually were killed in 1857. So a lot of the records that they would mention, a lot of the letters that they would be, sending to their folks back home were destroyed. And subsequently, it was only towards the end of the 19th century that a fresh, inquisitiveness was there to know about this revolution. So again, it's written in a novel form because we knew the limitations of bringing forth a book of history in its authenticity. So we followed a different approach with each of these three books.
But what was the approach that you chose, that you followed when you chose these 17 heroes? Because they're very eclectic.
Essentially, they needed to represent every part of the country. Essentially, there are 5 women in it. Yes. Rani Garinliu, there is a lady, Dasriben Mehta, who was in fact a Gandhian. Helen Lepcha was instrumental in making Subhash Chandra Bose escape from the country. So essentially, they were representative of the different geographical regions of the country, because it's very interesting, like I mentioned, all of these revolutions across the country erupted roughly around the same time, with of course the present Jharkhand being the epicenter of these. But we tried to make it as representative as possible, both of gender and geography.
Interestingly, when you talk about warriors from the Bhil tribe, there are 2 very interesting warriors that you've chosen. One is Tantia Bhil, and you describe him as a dacoit with good morals, right? And the other is...
I'll just answer that first. See, when it comes to Tantia Bhil, it was a difficult choice to make, but at the same time, the mindset that Tantia Bhil followed was a reallocation of wealth. So essentially, he would loot the Britishers, but ensure that that wealth was distributed among the poor. So obviously, with the limitations that they have in terms of education, I think one needs to be encouraging towards them. One needs to be encouraging towards the community. Because, unfortunately, the descendants of many of these tribal warriors still live in very abject and very difficult conditions. And I think by invoking their sacrifice, we would be doing a lot of good to their descendants and involving them in our nation-building efforts.
So one of the descendants of Komaram Bhim, his granddaughter, apparently is still waiting for an LPG connection. That's one of the...
Some of these things get highlighted because, unfortunately, you don't have too many things against the government, so you pick up and, the cherry picking is more. But if it is so, then obviously immediate, this is a very responsive government, and I'm sure within 24 hours of it coming to light, that would have been addressed.
Okay.
Also, at times, you need to authenticate whether the descendant is the right descendant, because, a large extended family of 100 descendants would all claim to be. I'm not disputing that, but like I said, if a lapse has occurred, I'm sure that would have been immediately rectified.
No, my point was that, it's been mentioned in the book that, the granddaughter works as a cook with earning a paltry sum of 3,000 rupees. So which is why I brought it up only to make a limited point that even though, these warriors, despite the kind of...
I'm sure with the changes in thought process that has come about in the last 9 years, many of these descendants would eventually be in leadership positions. So I think it's a work in progress, it's a journey ahead.
Okay. So, Suraj, these freedom movements were not only about freedom. A lot of the heroes also inspired their tribe spiritually. So, how much do you think, for instance, you have Guru Gobind Giri, who inspired the Bhil tribesmen, and it was just not only a political movement. So, what kind of an impact do you think these heroes had on their particular area of influence? And it was just not a political movement.
Yeah, so spirituality and life go hand in hand, and that is what not only India but across. If you see even the so-called Red Indian, the American tribes and all, everything was like connected with nature and spiritual. And you go to Australia, so there's always a connection with nature, and that's where the spirituality and connect comes in. Now coming to India, Bharat, there's a lot of different levels of communities with their own beliefs, with their own way of working, way of thinking. Now, different tribes have different way to connect with the message, and they all do this with stories. So if there was a spiritual leader one place, the story is told and retold, and the descendants keep following it. And that's where, whether it's Sidhu Khan or any of the 17 different leaders, their tribes, each will have their own unique way of history. They're all micro, like we have thing known as microfinance. Where, so there's always, I see that, I would think that something like a macro history. And knowing this micro history can actually help one understand that what goes behind the behavior and thinking and level of decision making in the tribes.
So, Sir, Jatra Oran, he introduced this concept of Tana Bhagat. And they were influenced by, by Mahatma Gandhi. But you also mentioned that the rather unfair treatment that was meted out to them by the Congress has made them shift, their allegiance.
So Jatra Ora's movement was largely very similar to the non-cooperation movement, and that happened around 13 years before the actual non-cooperation movement by Gandhiji. So, in a way, like I mentioned, there is so much to learn from the tribal community. His movement was not violent, so that's the beauty of this journey across, from 1783 to 1947. During the start, most of these revolutions would be centered around guerrilla warfare. Subsequently, post Birsa Munda's revolution, which is the early part of the 20th century, many of these, like even Alluri Sitaram Raju, is said to have been influenced by Gandhiji for most part of his career until, he realized that it was not working out, like many other people realized. So the same had happened with Jatra Ora also. It was a completely peaceful, non-violent movement where Adivasis essentially decided, or tribals of that region decided, that we are not going to cooperate with the Britishers. So we are not going to have any working association with them, we won't work for them. When you talk of Congress being unfair, I don't think I should be getting into it. They have been unfair to a lot of people, barring, a few chosen ones. So I think, let's not get into that.
So I would also like you to tell us a little about Jaipal Munda, who...
Jaipal Munda was the only tribal representative in the Constituent Assembly. Unfortunately, his legacy should have been spoken about more, because if you read some of his speeches, and some of them are easily accessible and available online, he has spoken about the tribal idea of democracy existing, since ages, since about 1,000 years ago. So every Adivasi home would have its own peculiar colored flag in many areas, and yet, they would be completely in unison, very united as a society. He was controversial also in certain parts. Like he was very, in fact, he was also the captain of the Indian hockey team. So he was adopted around 1908, 1909 by British missionaries who had sent him to London to study. So, in fact, he is one of the rare tribal revolutionaries who has worked in the corporate world in Africa in that era, who has been the captain of the Indian team. Again, he was controversial, so he had a fight with some of the team members in 1928, and yeah. But he was very openly pro alcohol. That is another aspect of it, and like he was a maverick in politics. That's what I can say. 70 years after he's no more. He died in 1970, in fact. But he was, I think, a true blue maverick, very open about his views, even though his views were contrarian in many ways to the politics of that era.
One question about the women warriors. The first is Helen Lepcha.
Let's focus on, the Sidhu Kanu's sisters, because we
Sure,
would
sure.
have limited time. And in fact, there is a lot to be said about Sidhu Kanu's movement was not merely about Sidhu Kanu. It was
Yes.
about an entire family getting together. Sidhu Kanu, Chand, Bhairav, the four brothers,
brothers.
and two sisters, Phulo and Jano. So let's
So why
Suraj
don't
talk
you
about
tell us about the contribution that the sisters, the Murmu sisters, have made to this entire effort?
Yeah, so as rightly we were discussing and hearing right now, the tribal folks had a lot of unity, a way of, even though they had the independent house flags, but they together community. So this community was just not made for men. It was an equal way of equal ownership. They were people working together in fields, doing the activities together and all. And even the 1855 revolution, the whole revolution wasn't any different. Where apart from the four brothers, the two sisters, Phulo, Jano, had actually, there are some written documents that they actually launched an attack in the East Indian Company, British encampment also in the night, leading the warriors. And the thing is about that, everything is lost in the times of sand. And unless we don't tell the story, unless we don't bring back some perspective, yes, some of it is fiction element we have added. But these are just gaps we're trying to fill, because any revolution always have its own pattern, and we saw that pattern and we just fill those gaps out there. But if you Google in terms of Murmu sisters, you'll see very few mentions out there. And you can imagine it's 1855, they're in the tribes, in the jungles, and they are fighting against the might of the British Empire, and there were ladies leading men, the attacks. So you can imagine the strength of the freedom of independent of the mind for the culture to actually bring that in. So, yeah, that I would like to share.
Thank you so much.